thank you so much, Maya, and thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much, Maria. Delighted to have this conversation today. And I thought to begin with the beginning, it would be somehow interesting to talk a little bit about this idea of beginning, new institutions for the 21st century. And I think we can only address the topics and the urgent theme of the 21st century if we go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge and create institutions where we do not have, walls, geographical or walls of disciplines, but in a way can remove those walls, remove those silos. And of course, we are having here an amazing constellation because we have, on the one hand, Maya and Richard with us today, and of course, Maya Maya's vision is the LUMA project in Arles, which is basically opening next year. It has actually opened already many years ago as a prefiguration, where basically ecology plays a very special role, and where many different disciplines play together. And Richard, of course, as well, is founding an institution with the Teatro Mundi. So I thought it would be somehow interesting, before we go more into detail, this question for Richard about his books, also about cooperation, because we wanted actually last year to discuss, cooperation in Arles, and that's of course still a relevant theme. That was the theme of last year's LUMA Day. But I thought before we start all of that, it would be somehow interesting to have an exchange between Maya and Richard about what it means to start an institution for the 21st century.
Aha. Well, that's a big subject. I tell you what it meant to me when I started Teatro Mundi. I felt that the practices of city making had lost their vision, and that to do better kinds of urban planning, we needed to involve people who had nothing to do with urban planning, that is, with performing artists. And so when I started Teatro Mundi 8 years ago, my notion was that we would get choreographers, dancers, actors, scenographers, together with engineers and architects and planners, and see what happened. And the only thing I knew was that everybody had to be young. If this was going to be a 21st century project, it shouldn't be elderly people like myself dispensing wisdom, but that it should be young and it should have the capacity to fail, to pursue dead ends, to try things out, to experiment. So the kinds of things we've done in the last 10 years, for instance, has put choreographers together with traffic engineers to think about expressive movements. We've asked painters to think about ways that color could be used as an element in urban design, particularly in public space. And at a more theoretical level, we've looked at ways in which the city is a kind of theater. So that's kind of what was in my mind. I started this out as a project based in London. And when Brexit loomed, I thought, well, maybe we should have some kind of protection just in case something went wrong and Brexit actually came into being, that we would be isolated in Britain. And unfortunately, it did come into being. So we are now a kind of bi-urban activity. We're based in London, but also in Paris. And we're focusing a lot on the Mediterranean. Thanks to the Onassis Foundation, we made contact with young dancers and sound artists in Beirut, in Athens, and in Tunis, and in Marseille. So I'm sad that we've had to do this in a way, but also glad that it's, an open door. The last thing I'd say about Tetramundi now is that, and this has to do with the whole situation of young artists in Britain, which is that they are menaced by a kind of cultural isolation and inward lookingness in the United Kingdom. And that now I see this organization, I never thought of it that way, as a way of helping young artists, performing artists, and young urbanists to look beyond the UK. And we're making residencies for them in the Mediterranean and in France to do just that. When I came to Britain, it was the center of Europe. And unfortunately, that's no longer going to be the case. And our institution is adapting to that geopolitical change.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I think it would be great to hear a little bit from Maja about the beginnings of LUMA Arles, because as opposed to many new museums, this is not just about one building. It is really an archipelago, as Edouard Glissant taught us, which you imagined from the beginning. And in a similar way to Richard, it involves many different aspects. It involves this Atelier LUMA, the production of reality with design and ecology. It involves residences. It will involve a school, archives. So I think it would be great, sort of, because there seems to be a resonance really with that.
Yeah, I mean, the resonance is certainly there in terms of what I hear a lot in the last years, but which was lesser when we started, about this pluridisciplinarity and this different activities going on at the same time, and trying to define, in this case, the world of contemporary art. Yeah, we do social impact. We speak about ecology. In LUMA Arles, I decided to settle the foundation here, not to have the headquarters of the foundation, but just to have one of the major activity, which is to take care of the environment and take care of the needs of human rights. And all this makes sense once you can create different layers to an institution. So it's the end of ultra-specialization, and it is putting together some humanities in order to create a humanistic program.
Yeah, last year's theme of our conversation would have been the rituals, pleasures, and politics of cooperation, and maybe interdependence in relation to that, no? And of course, cooperation is your great book from 2012. It's the topic of your great book. We've discussed this before, but it would just be interesting to hear a little bit what sparked your interest in the topic, why you felt that it's such an important topic for the 21st century, because I think it has a lot to do with that theme also of an art institution.
Yes, I have to say that my interest in this was both artistic and sociological. The artistic one is very personal to me. I'm a musician at night. That's my other life. And I play chamber music, and chamber music is an cooperative art. So I've always been interested in how cooperation works in producing a collective piece of art, which every piece of chamber music is. Socially, I was interested in this way, which I don't know really fits into your theme or not. Mm-hmm. Because for me, there's a tension between cooperation and solidarity that as I see in my work always with the UN, the cooperation involves getting people who don't like each other, don't understand each other, are very different, to work together on projects where they don't coalesce and become independent. There isn't great solidarity in the sense of doing something collectively together, which draws people together, as you would have in, say, playing a string quartet. And I think we often misunderstand that the 21st century is very big on the idea of solidarities, identity solidarities, class solidarity, all sorts of ways in which we want to emphasize community with people. And I think that's mistaken. I think that the real issue is how to get people who are different to work together. That's, to me, the big challenge in our time. And it's one which is a challenge which is very framed by the politics we have in Europe now, which is swept by right-wing regimes, which are very solidaristic, hostile to foreigners, in many cases, class-ridden, very ethnophobic. And that, it seems to me, is what we have to overcome. So I don't know how this fits into your theme last year. Certainly artistically, cooperation is a great thing. But sociologically, it carries a lot of weight, which is uncomfortable.
No, and it's really very relevant. And we're going to come in a minute to this year's theme. But just to wrap up, this conversation on cooperation, because it's obviously interesting also that it leads to the question of coexisting. And I was rereading again your book, Open City, actually, and you discussed there the importance of people from different backgrounds coming together, and how that can actually, help us to avoid, as you said, the death of a city. Now, both Maja and you spoke about, this idea of new institutions, and new institutions not only as a building or a new, museum or Kunsthalle, but new institutions as a form of urbanism. And so, of course, for these institutions, and we spoke about it actually with Maja today in Arles, how important it is for this institution to do what you describe in Open City, to actually bring people from different backgrounds together, and not only to bring them together in an institution, but to actually also go into different neighborhoods with these projects. So it would be great to hear a little bit more about that and how you see it now, particularly, because of course now it's a very different moment than when we discussed this last time, because now we're basically in this COVID moment and in the moment of social distancing. So it's an even more important topic.
Well, I'd like to know from Maja how LUMA gets out of its institutional base. How do you get into the?
It makes me think that I don't really understand or like even so much the word of institution. I'm more referring to projects.
Right.
And,
I like that word better too.
Yeah,
I agree.
Because it makes me think also when I was working in Africa, when I was younger, in some environmental cooperation projects, let's say in Mauritania, and or also in Southeast Asia, or even only a guest on these projects, we always had a counterpart on every trip that we made on the premises. I was just referring of what you said before. between the cooperation is not always a happy collaboration because of the different how do you say, the different origins of the people and culturally the differences. So I've always been trying to make projects work. So first, so the institution is a collection of projects, so to say.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, and this is also what's referring to this archipelago principle that maybe Hans Ulrich can talk about, because it's coming from Edouard Glissant and from a way of describing how these things can happen jointly. And so it gives a depth to what we now call the institution, which is really, really exciting. And it's always in the coming, it's always in the devenir. It's always in transformation. And these relationships I'm very interested in.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the issues for me in making, with my colleagues in making Teatro Mundi, was how to let things die. Not how to, which is the essence of a project, that in time it exhausts itself and so on. Art institutions don't like to extinguish themselves.
Yeah.
You know?
It's interesting.
And, but they should die. Museums should close.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hard for people. I mean, in a way that makes a lot of sense. But if you've spent 4 or 5 years working on something very intensely, it's very hard to surrender it. And it's a problem not only in institutions, but it's also a problem in any kind of making, any kind of poiesis, which is when to let something go. And again, on a sort of sociological side of this, that was the great error of 20th century understanding of organizations, which is that the more durable, the more long-term an organization is, the stronger it is. It's the logic of Amazon, of the multinational, corporation, which goes on and on and on. So I think there's something that we learn as artists about surrender, which also has a kind of political implication too, about when we call institutions over in the state. In my view, this is just my politics. I think, for instance, that institutions like NATO should end, that most military installations should end. They no longer have a purpose. And we need other kinds of institutions to make us secure. Mm-hmm. But that's true in economics as well. But it's something that I think artists have to learn very painfully. But when they get that knowledge, that has an implication for society at large.
And of course, that brings us to what, Cedric Price and John Littlewood, which is actually interesting, in terms of street theater, because John Littlewood was, of course, in the 60s a great protagonist of street theater in the UK, and Cedric Price, the great architect, and they teamed up and joined forces to invent the Fun Palace. And from the very beginning, this interdisciplinary organization, which was actually also an inspiration for LUMA Arles. The idea was always that it wouldn't be there forever. The Fun Palace, Cedric said, should have a limited lifespan. But I wanted to come back to the American basically to the archipelago. And Glissant says that the American archipelagos are important because he said that institutions shouldn't be continents, but he says we should learn from the archipelagos because it's in these islands that the idea of creolization, the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. He told me that continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. Glissant said I can change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And it's actually archipelagic thought, Glissant said, that teaches us this. Now, he had a very pragmatic approach to that and wanted actually, after founding a school in Martinique, which was so influential for entire generations, he wanted to build a museum. He wanted to build actually an institution for Martinique, or as Maja said, we should maybe rather call it a project. He wanted to do a project which would be a museum as an archipelago, which would not have housed the synthesis serving to standardize, because of course many museums have this synthesis approach which he called standardizing, but rather it would be a network of interrelationships between various traditions and perspectives. The museum would not illustrate previously established findings, but function as an active laboratory. It's not a recapitulation of something which existed in an obvious way, but it's the quest for something we don't know yet. And if it is not about resuming things we already know, but if it's a search for something we don't know yet, that means, of course, that it's also a laboratory of some sort. Now, now I want to ask you, Richard, to comment on that.
Well, it's very interesting. My ideal museum, don't take this personally, Hans Ulrich, except for you, it would have no curators. It would have no placards next to works of art explaining what they were. It would not have a clear path moving from one space or one room to another. It would be a passive institution where people had to make their way and make their meanings by themselves. So that's my ideal institution. It's a little like the Serpentine in moments when people are not really concentrating on curating something, but just letting it be.
Now, we've spoken about the Glissant thing, but we've also evoked the Femme Palace. And in your new book, Richard, you talk about the stage and the street and how actually these two domains, relate. And you also say that remembering can be a danger. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, that's just a comment to myself at the opening of this book, which is a very personal book since I've had this dual life, about the fact that there's a lot of waste in people's experience, where something that's relevant to me is not of interest to anybody else. And what I'm really interested in is a project of how we become the editors and sometimes the radical critics of our own experience, of our own memory. That's a question about time. I don't like very much the kinds of books like Nausgaard, which are just an assemblage of everything that's happening to him on the notion that somehow it will be seductive to other people. It's just the opposite of what I think about a museum should be, which is passive. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, the book, if I may say something about that, is really about the relationship between enactment as a fundamental mode of human expression and how it differs in the street from on the stage. That is, what are the connections between ordinary forms of enactment like ritual and artistic forms of enactment? There are similarities, there are also contrasts. And I'm interested also in the book in the ways in which artistic power of enactment can, in the political sphere, the great dictators are often very great actors. And I'm interested in the ways in which the whole performance ethos can take a negative as well as a positive impact. I guess where this would intersect with your worlds is that I think a lot of performance art is not very self-critical about the act of performing. And it's something that strikes me. The one artist I know who is very self-critical about performance art is Bill Kentridge, who is very suspicious of the seductions and the power of what this kind of art can command. So I think that's maybe something to look at sometime, which is this relation between stage and street. We don't want to think about the city as a work of art, but it can be made a work of art, which is a very destructive one. It's the theatrical equivalent of Corbusier, who conceived of the form of the city as a kind of work of art. So that's what my book is about. And as I said, I'd be interested from you, Hans Ulrich, to know how do you react to performance as a mode of art making? Does it seem to you as ambiguous as it seems to Bill Kentridge, or is it something that seems to you more neutral?
I think one of the main distinctions, I think, in terms of performances and exhibitions is of course the idea. Probably we could sort of summarize it. It's a bit simplistic, but summarize it by saying that a performance is very often an appointment, whilst an exhibition has opening hours. And that means one can go there whenever one wants and stay there as long as one wants. It's now, of course, changing with COVID because, we are reopening the Serpentine, like all museums which are now reopening are facing the same challenge, which means that now there have to be appointments, which means because of the limited number of people, even we're having free admission, an appointment is needed and there is only much less people than normally who can actually access the exhibition. So it becomes a sort of an in-between space between an appointment and an exhibition. But normally, under circumstances pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID, one can just show up at the exhibition, and it can be an improvised decision to visit an exhibition, whilst the performance is an appointment. Now, obviously, numerous artists from Tino Segal to Ottobon Nekanga, Laura Lima, from many different artists have actually been questioning that idea of a performance being an appointment and have worked, and that's something which already started in the 60s. We have the Bruce Nauman pieces, which or John Jonas. I've been thinking about this idea how actually performance in that sense can all of a sudden not be an appointment, but can actually which we tried to summarize with the exhibition 11, 12, 13, 14 rooms, and I think in a way that means that then all of a sudden a performative work can actually have opening hours. It's there almost like a living sculpture all day long. But one of the things I was very interested, particularly in terms of your book and also your project, actually with the Teatro Mundi, is of course this negotiation in a way which involves the stage and the city. And very often performances actually do happen in enclosed spaces. They happen in museums or Kunsthalle, and they're not necessarily in that sense happening as public art in the streets or outdoors. And I think in a way, not only now with the social distancing, where there is a necessity, to do more things, or also a desire, I would say, from a lot of people to not only do more things, but also experience more things outdoors. but also just in general, I think with this idea that we cannot just wait for visitors to come to the institution or the project or or to the Serpentine or to LUMA or to Teatro Mundi, but that we actually with our projects need to go to people. And that's something Edouard Glissant said. He said we need to find art which can actually visit people in a way. And that's of course something which Arthur Jafa also pointed out. We worked with him at the Serpentine and twice actually at LUMA in Arles. And Arthur Jafa always says, he actually wants with his work also to go to the visitors, which is why he conceived for his videos of a tent. And with this tent, he wants to go into different neighborhoods. And that, of course, brings us also to the fact that there are many people, particularly in big cities, who live in neighborhoods where they very seldomly or almost never, visit museums. And in that sense, entire generations grow up who don't have a contact zone with art. And so I'm very interested in this idea how we can actually go not only with exhibitions. Edouard Glissant said we need to bring exhibitions to the people. And we've just done an exhibition in Arles with Maja called It's Urgent, where we invited 130 artists. And it's a growing exhibition to do posters. And these posters can happen in a building, but they can also happen in the street. They can also be downloaded and people can put them, can download them and put them wherever they want. So that was that idea of Glissant, that an exhibition can go to the people. But I thought with Teatro Mundi and your theme of the stage and the city, that there is a big possibility also. And of course, we need to think, I think, particularly in the current moment also what happened in the 1930s with the New Deal, with Roosevelt and the New Deal, and the incredible increase there was for public art. The gap between art and different publics became lesser because actually art, with the New Deal of Roosevelt, with the community centers, with the public art forms, was brought to places where, and to also contexts where basically otherwise art would never have visited. And I was wondering your thoughts on that in terms of the city, and the inequality and how we can actually find ways to not just have theaters and museums and institutions where people, are gathering, but how can we go to the people?
Well, it's very interesting you say that. I'm working with Tania Bruguera now on a project which essentially will revive the old Commedia dell'arte improvised stages. Now, Tania, as you know, is a very political artist. And this is a kind of different aspect of her work, which is, and it's got this reference, the old Commedia dell'arte were traveling troupes which could set themselves up on the stage anywhere in 10 minutes. They had very simple costumes. They were halfway between kind of ritualized plays, things that were improvised. And we're doing this in Berlin, and we're interested in how to make something which is half between ritualized formula and improvisation in a Commedia dell'arte stage that moves around the city and comments on politics. So it's something very much in it's what you're talking about is something that seems to me not so much an innovation, but a kind of recovery of the way in which people traditionally experienced a theater, which is that theater didn't need a theater. And I guess the question I would ask you is, what do you think museums are for in that context? What can they do that, say, Tania and I couldn't do? What could performance art inside the confines of Tate Modern or the Serpentine do that Tania and I couldn't do on the street?
I mean, it takes us a bit away, I think, from the theme of the conversation, but I think it's at the same time a super
answer.
Because I don't want to say here too much because we really want to listen to you. But I will answer the question. We can then cut it out later.
Oh no, don't. I'm really curious. What do you think?
But I think one possible answer, Richard, is that, if we think back to the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, when Maja and I met, we met on the stairways of the Fridericianum in 1987, right? In Kassel.
Time ago.
Yeah, and that was 87. That was like more than 30 years ago. And at that time, when you went to museums and you went to see exhibitions, you mostly had painting, photography, installation, sculpture, and you very rarely had videos. Very rarely videos. And when, for example, the Whitney Biennial at that time would show videos, as Jonas Mekas always said, it would be in the basement or somewhere as a program. And, it would be very marginal. And what has happened through the 90s, and actually something which has been very much at the forefront of many LUMA projects, has been, moving image in terms of multi-screen installations as real experience spaces, which can happen in exhibitions and museums. And today, when you go to a museum, that forms an important part of the collection. But I think what happens really is that performance art in big part still remains invisible when you visit, collections of museums. And I think that's what, since the 2000s, with this performance, in a way, with this stronger presence of performance, is about to change. So one thing certainly museums can do is that, in a way, they find way to put it in a collection. And of course, not only through archive, but again, actually with these living sculptures, these are works which almost in the collection can be performed every day. It's just that the sculptures go home when the museum closes at 6 p.m. And then, of course, the museum can also be an archive, for ephemeral, can archive the memory, which leads us back to LUMA, right? Because Maja Archives has played a very big role from the beginning in your vision for LUMA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Archive, sure, because it's more than archive, I would say it's documentation of this time that seems passing in an accelerated fashion. And you need to recall why and how, and to re-put it into context, how things happened. So an archive is really this memory, which I think can be interesting without, you see, Richard, you said you would like to go to a museum without putting all the explanation always of the curation on the objects you're actually looking at, be there on the wall or be there a sculpture. I think we need to have this type of archive, and based upon that, let our I don't know the word in English, it's like the feelings, we need to be a little more emotional probably with what we see at the museum, and trust our own power to understand what was going on, and probably rewrite the piece of art by projecting probably yourself. It could be, if it's personal, or a whole group or new ideas into it, and then you become a creative person by doing this. If I react on what you said about letting things die, you touch upon something that is also related to what I'm trying to express here. Since the beginning, when with Hans Ulrich and others, we created a group of reflection on this core group to discuss about the program. And myself, from my side, what I was thinking about, how can I make it happen? How can I finance it? How can I make this thing? I never thought, and probably this is my feminine side, because I still have one, even if I have to take many masculine decisions lately. I can make it happen only for the sake of happening. I do not have to build my own monument. Right. So there's nothing monumental in what we do at LUMA. It's an addition of layers, and this layering gives the opportunity for change.
Well, that's wonderful. I think actually what we're talking about is really at the heart of what I'm thinking about in this new book. which is how to relieve people of the passivity of being a spectator. That's what our Berlin project is going to be about.
Yeah.
But I think it's a much more general problem that modern society makes people spectators to life. And, a museum that organizes an experience, where you've got the little headsets that are telling you, and now we move to the next great work of art, which means X, Y, and Z. That's all creating, in the process of creating spectacle, it's creating kind of spectatorship. And that has an incredible resonance with pacification and spectatorship in the society. So I think that's one sort of thing, a thread between what we've been talking about. The other about this, I think, is something that's quite interesting, because you talk about making something happening and documenting it when it happens. This may be the difference between a visual sensibility and a musical sensibility. When I give a performance, which I still occasionally do, the documentation is already there. It's the score. My notion is to make it, to bring it to life in such a way that this one time, right now, is what matters. Not that you have the memory of, what the Beethoven string quartet is like, what the score is, but that it's something that goes into another zone, which is imminent. And it's almost as though if you're a great musician, which I'm certainly not, but if you're a great musician, you will make the audience feel like I've never heard this before. It's got that quality of presence. So it's one of the reasons that now in recordings, for instance, we're moving classical music, and also I gather in some forms of more popular music, to the notion of simply, instead of doing a zillion takes, just to record something live, to get the best possible registration of something happening right now and happening only once. So that may be a very different, that kind of experience of music may be very different to what happens in the visual realm, where you have a tangible object to conserve, to document, to hold on to. From the musician's point of view, that's surrender is also that notion that you play it once and that's it. You may play it in another city another way, but for that, the moment you're on stage, that's your giving, that's what you have to give away, that moment. So maybe that's a difference in sensibility. So I guess what I'm saying is that on the one hand, I think what we're both talking about is overcoming spectatorship, but that overcoming may have a very different format between the ear and the eye.
Fascinating. Now, that brings us also to the chapter we haven't yet discussed in your book, which you've kindly emailed us, which has to do with liberation. And of course, it's interesting. Basically, the other day, Philippe Pareno mentioned again the association of liberated time, of liberated times, which he and colleagues did in the 1990s, l'association du temps libéré, the association of liberated time. Can you tell us a little bit about that notion? Because it's a very relevant notion also in relation to projects now.
Well, what you read is the beginning of a big question mark for me, and I'll explain it to you personally. When I started working with performance art in the 60s, I was working mostly with choreographers who had been influenced by Merce Cunningham, who wanted to create a kind of way of moving which took them outside the confines of classical, certainly of ballet, but also of classical modern dance. And these were very political. I'm thinking of people like Trisha Brown, Yvonne Rainer, people associated in New York with
Simon Fati.
So yeah, the Dutch movement. And I was one of their sound artists. And here's the thing that happened. They had, on the one hand, a notion that movement and sound should become closer to the experience of everyday people. That how you move on stage should, in a way, make use of the ways people move naturally in the street. On the other hand, they were incredibly innovative, avant-garde practitioners. Trish, for instance, would put dancers in harnesses so they could walk up the side of walls, suspended from gravity. It's very, very difficult to do. And what this meant was that there was kind of conflict between the political values, which were bringing stage and street together, and the innovative practices, which were their creative work, which was high art. And I think that that's a tension that rather than burying, we should surface. That is, what can be shared with the public that engages them, that gets them beyond the domain of being spectators, and what belongs to the art itself as something that can't be shared. And I would say that every activity of liberation has to deal with that contradiction. You can't solve it. You could solve it by saying, I'll never move in any way that is different from the way people ordinarily move. Or you could solve it by saying, screw the public. But it's holding those two things in tension between this notion of overcoming spectatorship and a poiesis of making something, which is, I think, the dynamic of liberation. It's a tension. It's not a recipe. And in the course of my book, which is not yet published, but will be published cheaply with wonderful illustrations chosen by you, it's that, liberation doesn't mean the end of conflict. It means the acknowledgement of conflict. And that's what I'm trying to get a hold of in this study.
Wonderful. This is a great, I think, wrapping up of that chapter. And of course, we are so lucky and happy and grateful that we can do this conversation with you, because literally we can connect the last year LUMA days where we almost met but then couldn't meet. We can connect it actually to this year's LUMA days, which because of COVID have gone virtual, but we can also connect it to your new book. So it's literally a journey, and as part of that journey, there were a few questions we were wondering in terms of the geography of change, this idea of in transit, which is part of the virtual LUMA days 2020. And I'm kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about the world we are now living in today, in late July 2020, in this moment of crisis, and wondering if this moment of crisis changes the way you work, and also what kind of would be a scenario you see for the next 24 months?
Well, here I put my urbanist hat on and take my musician hat off. What I'm very worried about is that we're in a very extreme situation in which we have to physically distance people. And what I worry about is that we normalize that. I hate the word social distancing. In 24 months, we'll have a vaccine, and we'll have, as we already have, good treatments for the worst kinds of COVID. We'll have better treatments for lesser kinds of COVID. It would be a disaster to create socially isolated cities, because right now we're at an extreme condition where for a few months we need to practice physical isolation. And what it puts me in mind of is very much when I worked in New York as a city planner after 9/11, the attack on New York City at that time, that there were a whole bunch of laws written to create buildings which were rigid and bomb-proof and built like fortresses out of the notion that airplanes would be attacking New York City week after week, month after month. Didn't happen anymore. But those laws stayed on the books for nearly a decade, imprisoning the way in which people were able to build housing as well as commercial structures. My worry about the pandemic now is that we become panicked, and panic leads you to generalize the condition you're in as though it's always going to be like that. We have to be less panicked in thinking about the pandemic. We have to take it seriously as a moment which we will eventually master. We're already on the process to doing that. But we can do ourselves a lot of harm by precisely practicing thinking of social distancing as the future, which is the future with everybody is isolated. They live in suburbs. They live in one-bedroom houses. They only communicate by going online, having Zoom encounters. It's very hard to have sex on Zoom, but it's also hard to have any kind of, social life on it. And so that's, as I say, just thinking about this as urbanist, what really worries me is, and it's something abetted by the press, which is having a field day over panicking people. And if you think about this, if you had the reaction we're having to COVID, if you were a soldier, you would die. You have to keep your nerve when you're faced with a mortal threat. You have to be intelligent about it, rather than think, oh my God, what can I do? The only thing I can do is run away. So I know you didn't ask me to give you this screed about this, but it seems I'm so struck by this reaction, this passive reaction to it, to where we're at now, and could do enormous danger to cities. People would go and retreat. That's a terrible thing.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you a long discussion, thing about this. This is it's a big discussion for us in the UN, which is how do we not normalize panic in dealing with poor communities, which are frail and vulnerable anyhow, as it is.
And that's exactly my next question, Richard, because of course, with the lockdown of borders, there has been also an extreme rise of nationalism. Now, this is not only prompted by COVID, it already preceded COVID, thinking about the Brexit. And Edouard Glissant, to come back to him, has predicted that for a long time. He said we live in an age of homogenized globalization, which leads to extinction and destruction of the environment, needs to be resisted. But he says we also need to resist the counter-reaction to the homogenizing globalization. which will be an absence of solidarity, new forms of localism, new forms of nationalism. So Glissant basically said we need to resist both those forces and create what he called mondialité. And of course, now through the COVID crisis, this lack of solidarity and also between countries and the new form of nationalism has exacerbated. Now, I was very curious also, you're involved with the UN, where you see basically the place, the importance for international institutions, UNESCO, the UN, the World Health Organization at this moment in time. And then to come back to what you said before, that maybe some of these institutions are no longer able to cope with this current moment and that we actually need new ones. I wanted to ask you, Ernst Bloch, when pushed against the wall by Adorno, what is utopia, he said something is missing. So I was kind of wondering if there are maybe any missing new international institutions / projects, to go back to what Maja said before, for this very moment in time. Sorry for the long question.
No, it's a good question.
Yes.
It's a good question. Well, the one institution which I don't think is, despite Donald Trump, is out of date is WHO. And that is, if any institution embodies scientifically Glissant's idea of mondialité, it is WHO. I mean, the problem we're having is that institutions which should have been more proactive, like the European Union, in dealing with something that the disease doesn't know any borders. It doesn't have a passport. The institutions like the European Union were very passive in the beginning. And WHO, and more generally, the UN, can only do so much. We have no power to force people to do anything. We only have moral suasion. And in my bit of the UN, which has to do with the physical environment, it's the same sort of thing. There isn't a global government. So I don't think that the Trump vision, and I know you don't believe it either, is a correct one. I think the question is that when this pandemic is over, is why institutions like the European Union were asleep or were passive, given the fact that scientifically there was no way to ask the disease to show its passport. It's a real issue in Britain now this week, as you know, because it's pretty much destroyed travel to Spain. It's had a very nationalistic response to a set of medical conditions which aren't nationalistic, but which are regional. And one of the curious things about international organizations, I've worked with the UN for 35 years, so I am both a sufferer and a believer in it, is one of the curious things about international organizations like the UN is that they actually think more locally than nation states. They can look inside a country, say its city is like this or that city is like that, whereas a nation state tends to generalize to the conditions that apply to the whole. That's just what happened last week when the Brits suddenly announced to people, if you go to Spain, you'll have to quarantine for 14 days. So, I mean, it's a real, for us, I'm just talking to you about this is a practical thing that has nothing to do with art, but it's a real anomaly that if we could strengthen certain kinds of international institutions, we could think more locally.
That's actually a very beautiful, a very important conclusion. If I may, I have just one or two very last questions. One is sort of related to Bruno Latour. Latour wrote several texts during the lockdown. One is that the necessity of not returning to the normal, because of course he says it is just basically a rehearsal maybe of a much more challenging situation with the climate change which we're going towards. And he then did the questionnaire, the famous questionnaire. And taken from this questionnaire, I wanted to ask you two things. First of all, if you can name an activity, Richard, that you suspended during the lockdown that you would like to see not coming back. And secondly, if you can name an activity that you want to preserve at all costs.
Oh, these are questions asked to Bruno as well.
Yeah.
Is that it? I wish I knew his answers. Well, what I want to come back is theater, and I want to get over the notion of the crowd as a kind of as a dangerous sight. That I want to bring that, and I think it can come back medically. It's a really good question about what I think the what wouldn't I like to come back in the wake of this? I have to think about that. I'm so, my mind is so bent on this notion of people being panicked by the pandemic that I've concentrated much more on the harm they can do to themselves than the good that might come out of this. I know the good that's come out of it in poor communities in the global South is these are places that don't have a very strong safety net in terms of hospitals and things like that. And you have use of mobile phones and social networks to do things that in the global North we would take for granted that institutions would do. For instance, if somebody is social isolating, the whole networks in places like Sao Paulo or Rio, where people have invented these online short distance social networks to say, well, Mrs. Abreu is social distancing, bring her some food. That's a good thing that's come out of this, but it's the result also of a very bad situation, which is that there's nobody otherwise to take care of her. But I think in general, what the lasting negative mark, which I really fear about this, is that word social distancing, that becomes the new normal. That's what really worries me.
Very last question I wanted to ask you, and I've asked you that question before. It's the only recurrent question in all the conversations I record, and that's the question about the unrealized projects. Now, we know a lot about architects' unrealized projects because they don't, they publish them, but we know very little about writers, philosophers, artists, poets' unrealized projects. And there's a whole very wide range of the unrealized. I mean, last night we discussed, Maja and I, with Sophie Kahl, and Sophie actually has an unrealized project to make a film about all her unrealized projects. She has
She came with a long list.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
Tutor.
So our question is, Richard, if you could tell us about your unrealized projects, and these can be projects which have been too big to be realized or too small to be realized, utopic projects, unrealizable projects, partially realized projects. We, of course, also all have projects in our locker, unwritten books, forgotten projects.
Yeah.
Then there are, of course, the censored projects. And as my friend Doris Lessing, whenever I visited her and asked her again the same question, told me, she always told me, we also have the projects we haven't dared to do, which is a form of self-censorship. So there's a very wide range of the unbuilt. And I wanted to conclude this conversation, for which we are so grateful to you, with the question about your unrealized project.
Oh, so painful.
Oh, yeah.
So dreadfully painful.
Oh.
Well, I would say my unrealized and maybe unrealizable project is to make philosophy which combines, which is a work of art, social theory, which is a work of art. The aspiration of that would be to do what, say, Plato did or what Nietzsche did. And I'm afraid it's not going to happen for me. They were writers first. And I'm an okay writer, but I've never been able to make the theoretical thinking I do, and particularly thinking about cities, into something which has that feeling of being literature, a work of art. So I guess my unrealizable project is not being a genius.
Oh.
Amazing.
That's, you know, and it's unrealizable. It's not.
It will come. It will be realized someday.
I'm 77. There's not much time left. But
it has only just begun.
Time is a concept.
We interviewed Niemeyer when he was 103, and I've just done an interview with Lucita Hurtado, who turns 100 in a few weeks.
Okay. So I have 23. I have 23 years left.
And that leads to the very last question. Niemeyer, of course, talked about unrealized cities. And I was always wondering, it's something I always wanted to ask you, if you as an urbanist, because of course one of your many dimensions in your work is you as an urbanist, have ever thought of an imaginary city, or of a city you would like to build?
You know, I haven't. And I'll tell you why. This is a discussion I had with my great friend Italo Calvino when he wrote Imaginary Cities, the wonderful book. And I asked him, well, what do you feel about that? Could you imagine another city beyond the cities you've imagined? And he said, no, I think in a way this project was corrupt from the beginning, because of course all these cities are Venice. And the imagination of the unbuilt is in a way kind of denial of experience. I was so impressed by that, because of course we think of that book of Calvino's as a stimulus to imagining the things that don't yet exist. And to him, he was really worried about it. He wanted people to know that it was all about Venice, that it was about something that they could imagine, not that was unimaginable, and that there was something to conserve in Venice by thinking about it in this imaginative rather than imaginary way. And that's always struck with me, to take the city, the way people live as they live, and say, look, this is good enough, you know? If you're free, if you live in a complex situation, if you know the experience amount of, if you know what kind of justice you want and go after it, that's enough. You don't have to dream about an other, which is not yet existent. So I guess I don't think that way. As I say, it was so striking to me with Calvino. So we had many talks, and nearly as much liquor as you and I have had in our talks. He was somewhat abstemious, but he feared a certain kind of imagining, and so do I.
Thank you so much, Richard. This was amazing.